Now here comes a very interesting part, at least for me, which closely parallels what Dr. Michael Heiser calls the divine council, not just him, also the scholars who came before him and after him. And we can see in this particular passage, we can see some biblical parallels with Deuteronomy 32. Okay, so listen to this. It says, once upon a time, the gods divided up the earth between them, not in the course of a quarrel. It would be quite wrong to think that the gods do not know what is appropriate to them, or that knowing it, they would want to annex what properly belongs to others. Each gladly received his just allocation and settled his territories. And having done so, they proceeded to look after us meaning humans, their creatures and children, as shepherds look after their flocks. So at the very beginning, Kevin, we see, like I said, parallels with Deuteronomy 32, where God divided the planet and allotted to the sons of God. But then he says that
Hmm.
he kept Israel for himself. And I want to mention a name of one deity, which is coming soon. And then I would like you to comment on this.
Sure.
They did not use physical means of control, like shepherds who direct their flock with blows, but brought their influence to bear on the creature's most sensitive part, using persuasion as a steersman uses the helm to direct the mind as they saw fit, and so guide the whole mortal creature. The various gods then administered the various regions which had been allotted to them. But Athene and Hephaestus, who shared as brother and sister a common character and pursued the same ends in their love of knowledge and skill, were allotted this land of ours as their joint sphere and as a suitable and natural home for excellence and wisdom. They produced a native race of good men and gave them suitable political arrangements. Their names have been preserved, but what they did has been forgotten because of the destruction of their successors and the long lapse of time. For as we said before, the survivors of this destruction were unlettered mountain race who had just heard the names of the rulers of the land but knew little of their achievements. So what we see at the very beginning, like I said, is that the land of Atlantis was supposedly divided, and uh, before that even happened, their main deity happened to be Poseidon. So Poseidon's country happened to be Atlantis. So now he comes on the scene, and the land is divided, and the land is allotted to him the same way we see in Deuteronomy 32, that the whole land, the whole country, the whole planet is divided to different deities, the small g gods or the sons of God. Uh, Kevin, do you think there could be any biblical influence in this story? And if not direct influence, then what do these parallels tell us about the ancient people?
Yeah. So I would point out that throughout pretty much all the ancient world, there are certain stories that are universal. And we often hear this, and what we often hear is that there are certain stories that are universal, and one of the ones that we all hear about is the idea of a flood, and that just about every culture on earth, no matter how far spread apart they are, has some kind of mythology surrounding a flood. And interestingly enough, though, it actually goes deeper than that. So I'm going to read a section of Genesis here. Genesis 6, about 1 through 4. It says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim, or giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So the reason why I read that specific section that has probably been, depending on where you go to church, that's probably been passed over on your yearly Bible study, because that's not really the section that most people focus on when they read this story, but it's actually hugely important. And Nicola mentioned Dr. Michael Heiser, the late, great Dr. Michael Heiser. And Dr. Michael Heiser's work really opened a lot of people's eyes to a broader reality of what's going on in this passage, because what Genesis is doing here is making reference to some other mythologies that it's assumed that Moses's audience would be familiar with. And so now he's responding to that. He's not embracing everything that happens in those mythologies. He's correcting it, because in those mythologies, this is seen as a good thing, whereas God is showing us that it was actually a bad thing. But the point is that, you asked if I see any biblical parallels or biblical influence, and I do, not in that I don't think the Greeks had a copy of, the Torah, and that they understood that this was the influence. But if we believe that the story written in the Bible is true, then it makes sense that it was preserved somehow. And it was preserved as it was disseminated throughout the entire earth, but it was preserved not always perfectly, and it was often preserved through mythology. So in this case, we see actually a lot of parallels here, more than even a lot of scholars recognize. So for one thing, this text talks about the Nephilim, which Nephilim is Hebrew, it means giant, but we lose a little bit of that because we think giant means really tall person, and to some extent that was probably true, but in ancient Hebrew, the word Nephilim also had a different connotation, and excuse me, and in order to understand that connotation, I think a good way of thinking about it is, when I was younger, there was a dictator whose name was Manuel Noriega. And when people would talk about Manuel Noriega, they would call him a strong man. Well, they didn't mean that he was able to bench press really heavy weight. They meant that he was a tyrant and that he ruled a country with an iron fist. And the ancient Israelites had a similar expression to that. They would call someone a giant. So this is why in the Psalms, when it talks about the Exodus, it refers to Pharaoh as the Egyptian giant. Well, that doesn't mean that Pharaoh was really, really tall. It means that Pharaoh was this iron-fisted tyrant. So the reason why I share that is because in the Atlantis narrative, we see the same thing. These Atlanteans are these tyrants. They're these men of war. They build this empire. These are all the things that Genesis is telling us, but Genesis describes it in just a few verses because they assume that you're familiar with it from other stories. We've lost those other stories for the most part, which is why I always encourage people to read the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch goes into a lot more detail. I'm not saying the Book of Enoch should be included in the canon, but I'm just saying it helps you understand what's happening here in Genesis if you do read the Book of Enoch, because the Book of Enoch fills in a lot of these gaps about what's happening. But the point is that you have this story about these tyrants, these persecutors, going around conquering everything, subduing everyone, and imposing their will and causing a lot of mayhem and chaos and destruction. And that's what God is talking about, that the wickedness of man is great in the earth. Every intention of his thoughts are evil continually. and then God sends the flood, and it destroys the nation of Atlantis, or it destroys the whole antediluvian world. So we see a lot of parallels there, and I think it's important to note these parallels because I think there's a good argument to be made that the Atlantis story and these other myths that go along with it are all stories that inform us about what sort of the cultural memory of the fact that there was a world before the earth was flooded, and then there was a great cataclysmic flood event, and that great cataclysmic flood event created a huge transformation to the world. So we see in the end of the Atlantis myth that he describes the people who are left as these mountain herdsmen who were illiterate, and that's why the story, that's why a lot of these achievements don't come down to us in necessarily a perfect way, because he's saying that these people didn't have writing, and so they only had oral traditions to share to us. So he's saying that, well, what's interesting about that to me is that in Genesis, at the end of the flood narrative, we see Noah and his family leave the ark at Mount Ararat and descend the mountain and go out and, spread out from there. So they would have passed on the flood narrative and the rest of the narrative of the antediluvian world starting from that mountain. And so in a literal sense, I think that's what Plato's story is calling to mind. But I also think that Plato's story calls to mind the fact that he says the only people who survived this event were passed on this oral tradition, and now we have these details. So Plato is kind of or actually the priest who tells this story is kind of acknowledging the truth that all of these different cultures have these flood mythologies because there's a true story that they have a cultural memory of, but it's imperfect, it's incomplete. Well, we have that perfect and complete story because we're the people of God. We have the rest of the story. We have the fact that God flooded the earth because of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So we have this full story, and the other ancient societies are also narrating this story, but it's not preserved with all of the details, if that makes sense. So I totally believe that we're seeing examples of, again, when we're saying in a case like this, when we're saying that there's biblical influence, I don't mean that the Bible literally was written before this story, or anything like that. What I mean is that the true story that's recorded in the Bible is what's influencing the story of Atlantis.